the latest escalation between the United States and Russia. The United States is trying to somehow convince Iran not to go after nuclear weapons, or trying to say that it's not good for it's good for us, but it's not good for the others. But how about the latest escalation? What does that mean for Iran when the United States, in response to what was somehow a some sort of escalation on the part of Russians, but they were talking about the conventional weapons. They didn't talk about nuclear weapons. The United States is threatening Russia by sending two submarines, nuclear submarines, close to Russia. And this is some sort of escalation that we haven't seen before, even during the Biden administration. And the United States, on the other hand, has decided to put the missiles, nuclear missiles, back in Europe. They have withdrawn them in 1980s, and the Trump administration has decided to put them back. They can be used by F-35 against Russia. What does that mean for Iran, in your opinion?
Well, first, I think we have to keep in mind that the United States brought nuclear weapons to the UK before the Medvedev tweet. And so I think that's the real escalation when you bring nuclear weapons closer to Russian borders. That is the highest form of escalation without actually using nuclear weapons. So the fault lies with the United States and with Trump. The tweet by Medvedev is not really all that important. Maybe it could have been written better, but he's not the president of Russia. He's not the decision maker. And Trump's response was not really very meaningful because, based on my understanding, the uh, nuclear submarines are already in the oceans as they always are under normal circumstances, and they rotate. But I think the most important thing for me, looking at it from an Iranian perspective, is that in the past, the United States always tried to contain Iran, as they like to call it, or tried to harm Iran, or tried to undermine Iran, or tried to break Iran through sanctions and threats. So, on the one hand, the Americans would impose brutal sanctions, not just because of Iran's nuclear program, which is peaceful. The Americans are saying Iran shouldn't have the ability to enrich uranium. The issue has never been about nuclear weapons. They're saying Iran should not be able to enrich uranium. It's not Iran. It's like telling a country you're not allowed to have produce your own oil. You have to import oil. You can have a refinery, but you'll have to import the oil. So on the one hand, they punish and hurt Iranians, ordinary Iranians, because they want to block Iran from having a nuclear program. But then they also punish Iran for having a defense program. Its missile defense capabilities are also another excuse for the Americans to punish Iranians. And all of this, of course, is about Israel. So, whether it's the nuclear program, or whether it's a missile program, or whether it's human rights or global warming or whatever, they'll always find an excuse to sanction Iran, to hurt Iran, because the Americans and the Israeli regime have one policy for the region, and that is Israeli supremacy. But now the weapons that have been in the past used basically for Iran more than any other country, although you could also include small countries like Cuba, or smaller countries. I mean, Cuba is an important country. It's had a very important role in the 20th century in the anti-imperialist movement. But in any case, Iran was the first power that was attacked by the United States through sanctions and also the threats of war. We've heard all options are on the table being used for president after president after president against Iran. Now, what the United States is doing is that it's using the same models, as you alluded to, for Russia, for India, for China, for Brazil, interestingly, for important BRICS nations, and in other countries that it antagonizes. And this provides a lot of breathing room for the Iranians because they are no longer facing the they're not the focus of U.S. antagonism. Now, U.S. antagonism is basically being uh, spread across the globe, and it's sort of like when they put butter on bread. The larger the piece of bread, the thinner the butter, and so it's much more difficult for the Americans today to focus on Iran, and also because all these other countries are being antagonized by the United States, those countries have a an incentive to move closer towards Iran and to one another. And I think, for example, what the United States is doing with India is extraordinarily foolish because the Americans have been courting uh, the Indian government for decades now, and Trump is throwing it out the window. Now there may be a deal, and Trump may back down, but still, the way in which he's been treating India, the insulting remarks made by Trump, insulting remarks made by senior U.S. government officials, are not lost upon ordinary Indians. It's going to have a lasting impact. So this, I think, is for Iran. It's it empowers the country because the United States can no longer. So, for example, just one simple example. In the past, the United States focused on blocking Iran from exporting oil, and to a degree was successful. Although partially the fault was the Iranian government too under President Rouhani, because he did not seek to expand oil exports through means outside the current the Western dominated financial order. After Rouhani's term ended and President Raisi came to power, he changed the policy and he decided to push for Iranian oil exports. They were initially heavily subsidized. Then, gradually, when Iranian production reached maximum, the price of Iranian oil went up. And today we see Iran is exporting all of its oil. So, but in any case, it was always much more difficult for Iran to export its oil because the global oil market is large. Iran's oil production is significant, but it does not change the fate of the global oil market, especially since Iran's has been sanctioned for decades. But when Russia is added, then this becomes much more significant. And then you have Venezuela and so on. And so it becomes much more difficult for the Americans to block Iranian oil exports when multiple countries that are major oil producers are sanctioned. And then since these countries are I mean, the very fact that they're independent of the West is why they're sanctioned. Other countries that are threatened by the West, in order to gain greater security, energy security that meaning energy from countries that are independent of the West, they tilt towards countries like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and so on. And since those countries too are being targeted, they feel that this is necessary. So Iranian oil is exported more easily. It becomes increasingly difficult for the Americans to stop it. And there is a greater demand for Iranian oil for the reason that I explained. So the more the Americans spread this net of sanctions and threats of warfare across the globe, the better it is for countries in the global south that have been facing the brunt of American hostility.
Do you feel that, let's put it this way, we know that the Russian gas and energy that is going to India has been attacked. They were attacking these ships that they're they're carrying Russian oil and gas. But the alternative would be the north-south corridor. Is that going to complicate the situation? Is that going to how is that going to work? How is that we know that is the Russian the decision on the part of Russians and Iranian is getting somewhere in terms of dealing with these sort of threats, because it's not just about Russia. I'm talking about I mentioned Russia because it shows how, because people are reading about it right now and they know what has they have to know this is what has happened to Iran for such a long time, and Iran knows what does that mean for them and for their economy. How could this bring Russia and Iran together?
Well, first, I should add something that I forgot to say, and that is that these military threats that the United States has been using against Iran, as I alluded to earlier, options are being on the table. These are also now being directed towards other countries, like Russia, in the case of the Trump uh, social media posts about nuclear submarines. And this also increases solidarity among non Western countries with regards to the United States, because countries increasingly see that this is not about Iran. This is about the United States. This is not the fault of the victim. It is the aggressor, meaning the West, the United States, that is making these threats. The threat is not just directed at one particular state, it's directed at multiple states. It's even directed at uh, nuclear states like Russia, which have more nuclear warheads than does the United States itself. So I think that both the sanctions and the threats that the United States makes strengthens Iran, strengthens all of these countries, and draws them closer to each other against the United States. With regards to India, as I was saying earlier, we have to see where this ends and where this leads. If the United States indeed does impose tariffs on India as they've threatened, and the Indians don't back down, then I think that creates a very strong incentive for the North South corridor to expand more rapidly. Because even though Indian exports to the United States are not enormous, but I think it signals a fundamental shift in the United States away from India. And so India will obviously be searching for new partners. And in among BRICS nations, and I don't want to stress too much on BRICS. BRICS itself is not a NATO or it's not a European Union type of organization, but it is a place where world leaders, important world leaders, gather together and search for solutions uh, with regards to global issues and crises. So it is an important organization, but we shouldn't exaggerate what BRICS countries do. But in any case, the weakest link in BRICS has been India, and after India, Brazil. And what the United States has done in this latest round is that it has targeted Brazil and India more than any other country, because Russia has already been sanctioned, China is already antagonized, Iran is, of course, facing maximum pressure sanctions for since forever. So this, I think, is important. Even if there is a deal, I think it's going to have some sort of impact on the way in which India conducts foreign policy. And the same is true with Brazil. Because, as I said, as Trump said, words matter, ironically, coming from Trump, that says a lot because he says a lot of nonsense, but words do matter. And the way in which the United States has treated India over the past few days in particular has been pretty ugly. So this, I think, strengthens BRICS, but I really don't comprehend why Trump is doing this, because if I was among the political elite in the United States, I would definitely not try to push India and Brazil towards other BRICS nations.